Here we go again. Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. And welcome to Random Ramblings Part 3. It won't be the last part. There is going to be a little bit more, but I could probably keep going like this for quite a while yet. But here we go. Once upon a time, a farmer was running a quiet Sussex lane, and you know this is set in the past because it's quiet Sussex lane. As he turned a corner, he saw a hat lying in a pool of mud in the middle of the road. He leaned over very carefully and picked up the hat and was surprised to find a head underneath it. A young man with a relieved expression on his face, staring up at him. After a lot of hard work, the farmer managed to dig him out, and the two men sat by the road recovering. Every now and then, the young man in the hat would look at the pool of mud and then turn away. And after a while, he said to the farmer, thank you very much, but could you help me to pull my horse out now? I'm sorry about that. That is a very old joke. In fact, it could be said to be the old Sussex joke. I think I have mentioned before that Sussex was notoriously hard to travel around. Deep mud, heavily forested. I may have mentioned this several times actually. Things were improving in the early 19th century. Turnpikes were being built, which improved the major roads at least. And in 1835, you get the General Highway Act, which gave responsibility to maintain the roads to the local authorities. And of course, you also get the first railways appearing. I don't know why I called it railroads. By the early 1840s, there was a line between London and Brighton going through 3 bridges. And by 1866, East Grinstead was linked to that line at 3 bridges. But there was nothing south of East Grinstead. South and east was much quieter. But in 1877, a group of local landowners, including the Earl of Sheffield and Francis Duquois, and I never know how to pronounce his name, at Cortlands, formed the Lewis and East Grinstead Railway Company. And they received parliamentary permission to build a line from Lewis, which turned north at Culver Junction and up through Barkham, Newark and Chailey, Fletching and Sheffield Park, which was later shortened to Sheffield Park as the Earl of Sheffield objected to the inclusion of the word Fletching. Then up Horsted Canes, West Hoathly, Kingscote, and up to East Grinstead. And a number of camps were set up around the village for the workers. There was a big camp at Lywood Common, an even larger one at Hazeldean between Kingscote and East Grinstead. But the biggest of all was in West Hoathly, where you had 600 men camped in specially built huts that were built along Top Road. At least we think they were. They were temporary buildings. It's difficult to know exactly where they were. But you had surveyors and foremen and carpenters, bricklayers, stablemen, blacksmiths, and above all, there were navvies. Most of them came from Ireland. Some came from the north of England, but most came from Ireland. Unfortunately, none of them came with a particularly good reputation. This was a reputation that they reveled in and cultivated with great care. But the local authorities were so worried that 3 special constables were recruited in the village to cope with this influx of men. And so most of them were living in these huts, temporary huts in Sharpthorne. Some might have lodged locally, although it was always pretty difficult to get local people to take them in. And some may have slept rough, either living in shelters that they built for themselves, or living in barns, or even under haystacks. I say it was a tough life, and they had to be hard men to survive this. And so there may well have been about 100 huts. It had a bit of a Wild West feel to it, even in Sussex. So they were hard men, and their reputation was built largely on the fact that they were supposed to enjoy a drink or 2 or 3. And when they weren't actually working, they would spend a lot of time in the local pubs. If they couldn't get to the local pubs, they would make their own. And the police raided the camps quite regularly looking for illicit stills and hunting for unlicensed beer sellers. The drink led to violence. There was violence in the camps, and also trouble between the workers and the villagers. It also led to theft. There were professional gangs who followed the workmen around, but often the men were stealing simply to survive. They were not well equipped. In the winter, there was always a shortage of good clothing, so warm winter coats had a habit of disappearing from local houses during the winter. The men struggled to keep warm. On one occasion, 2 men died when they went to sleep next to a pile of smouldering ballast. They were overcome by fumes and never woke up again. So the men thought that the railway company's coal and timber was fair game to make fires. Unsurprisingly, the railway company had a slightly different view. The men were also hungry most of the time, so food would disappear. There was at least one occasion when a Sunday roast disappeared from a dining table minutes before it was due to be eaten. So they kept themselves fed by various different means. One of the West Hoathly men was sentenced to 14 days in jail for stealing a toy engine and a squeaking doll. This may suggest that he had his family with him. He was stealing for his children, for toys. It certainly was not unusual for the men to have their families, and it was an extremely hard life for the families as well. Some of the children, certainly not all of them, some of them would have gone to the village school, which greatly increased the size of the school for a few years. This caused its own problems. And in the autumn of 1879, there was an outbreak of smallpox in the camp. And the headmaster of the school, Mr. Worcester, had to send the children home to stop the epidemic from spreading. It wasn't just the children who were educated. The parish provided reading and writing books, copybooks, and slates for the navvies themselves in an attempt to teach the navvies to read. And the railway company built a hut in Sharpthorne, the recreational room, which would be used as a reading room. It was also used for entertainment. It functions as a coffee house and even as a mission hut for a local temperance society. But all of this was a way of trying to keep the men occupied and trying to keep them out of the local pubs, which didn't always succeed. The recreational hut actually outlived the railway and was only pulled down in the late 60s. It stood on Top Road, right at the bottom of Sharpthorne Hill on the north side. Plenty of pictures of it do survive. The reason there were so many men here, of course, is that they had to build a tunnel. And the tunnel was the first major engineering work that they undertook. It meant that they could use the spoil that came out of the tunnel to build the embankments in other parts of the line. And of course, to build the tunnel, they would need bricks. They needed an awful lot of bricks. Many of them were locally made. There is no record of when the first brickworks opened in the village. They were certainly here by the middle of the 19th century. The tithe map from 1841 includes brick fields on the edge of Duckles Wood, just off Fowles Lane, and also south of Tyes Cross near Dallingrig. And the Briggs family had a brick and tile works down Horsted Lane. The Briggs family later married into the Weller family, who I talked about last time. So the whole village is interlinked. In 1870, a man called Trayton Stevens, who I think I'm distantly related to, started a brickworks just north of Old Combe, down in the valley below Sharpthorne. He mixed ash and cinders with local Wadhurst clay to make a high quality, hard wearing brick. London had always had something of a difficulty disposing of its rubbish. And by the 1860s, they were sending it out to neighbouring counties in wagons. And some of those wagons were brought by Hudson's to West Hoathly. In many cases, they just dropped the rubbish down the nearest hole, but they recycled as much as they could. And Drayton Stevens was recycling the ash and the cinders from London when he made his bricks. And he was soon making 50,000 bricks a year, all by hand. But when the railway arrived, the works moved south and east to the New Combe brickfield, where it is today. And the old site was turned over to making wooden barrows, presumably the barrows that were used in the brickfields. Many of the brickmakers, including Drayton Stevens, came up from Hamsey, near Lewes, and they settled in the area that would later become Hamsey Road. So they were all brickworkers. They were soon making over 1 million bricks a year down at the New Combe brickfield. And so many of those went into the tunnel, they went into the bridges and other parts of the line, they went into the platforms of the station. So they were very important to the construction of the line. And it was the railway and the brickworks combined that really created the modern village of Sharpthorne. They started digging the tunnel from both ends, which is a sensible way to do it, and they met somewhere in the middle. It is brick lined, had 5 brick access shafts, also used as ventilation shafts. Most of it was dug by hand, though they did hit a band of rare blue clay that was so hard that they had to blast it out. But I'd say most dug by hand. Several men were injured during the building, and 2 were killed, including Henry Mile, who was a local man, a bricklayer, who was killed when the shoring holding up some of the brickwork collapsed. And he's buried over the road here in St Margaret's. His family at one point were landlords of the Vinals Cross. So Mile is an old family, goes back a long time. But they did eventually get the tunnel built. Ended up 731 yards long. I always struggle to remember that, but it's 731 yards long. In 1881, it's completed, and there are stones commemorating that at each end of the tunnel. The line itself opened in 1882, and it took about 5 years from the formation of the company for them to open the line. So they were working very quickly. The stations took a bit longer to build. They were designed by an architect from Preston called Thomas Myers, and they were among the most elaborate and expensive branch line stations ever built, with stained glass windows, decorative plaster work called pargeting, which you don't find much in Sussex. You mostly find that in East Anglia, and they had a lot of ornamental ironwork as well. They all look pretty much the same, but there were a few variations. West Hoathly had a built-in boot scraper and a built-in letterbox. We're back to the mud again. West Hoathly obviously needed the boot scraper. They were built in what was known as the Old English style, sometimes known as the Queen Anne School for some strange reason. And although West Hoathly Station was pulled down in 1967, if you want to know what it looked like, just go to Kingscote, because it is very, very similar. Someone's just rung my front doorbell, but they're going to have to wait. That's thrown me now. The site of the tunnel, as it is today, is slightly to the west of where it was supposed to be. But Francis de Croix and General Arbuthnot at Hoathly Hill objected to the original siting of the tunnel, saying it would interfere with their hunting and their game shooting. So they moved it slightly to the west, which was a shame because they aligned it with a series of underground springs and built it underneath a well. So the tunnel was notoriously wet, still is. This was a problem for much of the year, but not a serious one. It meant that anybody who put their head out of the train window going through the tunnel was going to get wet. But in the winter, when the water froze, it became a serious issue. And in most winters, they had to send gangs of men into the tunnel with pickaxes and shovels to break down icicles. And some of these icicles would stretch from the roof of the tunnel to the rails and would weigh over 150 kilos. They were an enormous weight. And as fast as they broke the icicles off, new ones would appear. So it was a never-ending job. In the cold winter of 1947, they filled 49 wagons of a ballast train with ice, all dug out in the teeth of an Arctic gale, which was blowing straight down the tunnel. So it was probably the coldest place in Sussex. And there was an article in the archive which said that's exactly what it was. I don't know whether they still have to do it today. They might have solved that problem, but I suspect every now and then they do have to send men in to clear out the ice again. Luckily, we don't have the cold winters so much these days, so it shouldn't be such a major issue. Now, the railway brought immense change all over the country, not just in the village, but it did have quite an effect here. Apart from anything else, it may well have influenced the way the village is both spelt and pronounced. It has been spelled and pronounced in a dozen different ways over the years. But in the second half of the 19th century, the most common spelling appears to be Hoathley, which would make it the same as Nutley and Chailey and Crawley. But at the station, they spelt it Hoathly, which would make it the same as Ardingly, which is where the controversy starts. In the archive, there are several copies of the parish magazine dating from the 1930s. And in two of those, there are reports of talks that Ursula Ridley gave to the local WI, in which she said the village should be pronounced Hoathly and not Hoathly. This tells me two things. If you take the WI as a good representative sample, which I'm sure they were, it meant that the villagers called it Hoathly, and Ursula didn't like this. The other thing it tells me is that they completely ignored her and continued to call it Hoathly and not Hoathly. And if you've been listening to these talks, you will know that I call it Hoathly and not Hoathly. This is largely because I make it a policy never to pick a fight with the WI. But I've called it Hoathly all my life, and I can't change. It doesn't matter. We know where we are. It really doesn't matter. And I know for a fact that they do have exactly the same argument in East Hoathly. So it's not just us. But say we know where we are. It doesn't matter. The line was really designed to be a goods line. For the first time, it meant that the village farmers could get their produce out of the village easily. And the main produce from West Hoathly would have been milk. London had almost insatiable appetite for milk. By 1850, it is thought that there were something like 25,000 dairy cows in London, mostly living in people's backyards or in cellars. But in the 1860s, most of them were wiped out by a virulent disease called rinderpest, which left London short of milk. And the railway company stepped in and shipped in milk from all over the country. A lot of milk came up from Devon, but West Hoathly sent milk as well. There were supposed to be convoys every day, 14 or 15 milk carts going down to the station, each one with two or three milk churns on it, to meet the 9 a.m. milk train. This would work out at something like 20,000 pints of milk a week, going from one station to London. After a while, so much milk was being sent to London and other large cities that it actually became scarce in the country where it was produced. But say even a small place like West Hoathly was sending a lot of milk up to London. Don't trust my arithmetic, by the way. That is a very rough calculation, but it was an awful lot of it. People did, of course, travel on the line. It meant the villagers could get out for the first time. It meant they could go to London, although very few of them would have done. When I came to the village in 1988, I know 2 or 3 elderly villagers who had still never been to London at that point. It is far more likely that the villagers would go down to the seaside and have a day in Brighton. And as they went down to Brighton for the day, the Londoners would come to West Hoathly for their day trip to what was known at the time as the Sussex Highlands. I don't know when they stopped calling it the Sussex Highlands, but it is a rather nice name for this area. But they enjoyed their day out. And as I said last time, the Redmonds and the Bombs produced lots of postcards of this village. And the main reason they produced these postcards was to sell them to the day trippers. Prior to the First World War, millions of postcards were being sent every year. And the postal service was such that they would arrive within several hours. They're almost as reliable, if not more reliable, than emails and texts. And they were sent in equal numbers. At a time when some parts of London had up to 12 postal deliveries a day. Not so many in the countryside. But that's why the Redmonds and the Bonds did so well, making postcards. As well as trippers, the railway brought wealthy businessmen from London who set up their estates locally, which provided much needed work for the local population. I don't know whether it had any influence on Charlotte and John Godwin King when they bought Stonelands here, but certainly it is supposed to have influenced William Robinson when he bought Gravetye Manor in 1885. Robinson was a very keen user of the railway. He would walk to the station every morning with a servant carrying a clean pair of shoes. When he got to the station, he would change into those shoes. The servant would take the muddy boots back to Gravetye. He would clean the boots, then walk to the station to meet William Robinson in the afternoon. William Robinson would change into his walking boots and walk back to Gravetye. And he did this until he was 61, when he unfortunately fell while walking, fell over a stile and injured his back to such an extent that he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But he continued to use the railway. He did have a profound effect on it in one way. It is said that when he travelled on the railway, he often took paper bags full of bluebell bulbs and primrose seeds. And as he travelled along, he would throw the bulbs or the seeds out of the train window onto the embankments. And this is why the line became known as the Bluebell and Primrose line. They dropped the Primrose a long time ago, but of course still known as the Bluebell line. And I think the bluebells that are still there are probably descendants of the one that were sown by William Robinson. I hope that story is true. It really ought to be true. During the war, the children used the line to get to school, which they were quite happy about. They enjoyed the trip. They were also happy because the train didn't get into East Grinstead until after school had started. And the train coming home again left before school finished. So the children from West Hoathly and the other outlying villages had a much shorter school day than their classmates who actually lived in East Grinstead. There was such a long wait in the evening for getting back that they threw them out of, they made sure they got the train no matter what. And even if there was an air raid going on, they would throw them out of the shelters for them to catch the trains. I think they got home safely on every day, but there were occurrences on the line. A plane attacked a train short of Newark and Chailey station, and it had to hide in the Cinder Hill tunnel, although one of the passengers was seriously injured. The line was a legitimate target because it did carry troops, and it also carried a lot of ammunition. And much of the ammunition was destined for Gravetye Manor, where there was a big dump. My father remembers delivering meat to Gravetye during the war in the family van. He learnt to drive age 14 or 15 in the van by going up and down the long drive at Gravetye and the other big estates. He was always waved straight through all the security checks, but he did remember seeing a huge amount of ammunition piled up underneath the rhododendrons next to the drives at Gravetye. And he always said that if a bomb had landed in the woods at Gravetye, it would have probably taken out much of West Hoathly. One did come quite close. It fell on the line at Birch Cutting near Mill Place, destroying one of the rails. The worst incident on the line, the saddest incident on the line, was the young couple who were killed by a train while walking on the line at Noble's Farm, south of Horsted Keynes. It was their wedding day, and they had been married for 5 hours. And they're buried in Horsted Keynes, which is where they had been married, buried side by side in the same grave. So there were sad incidents on the line. After the war, the children were sent to school by bus. Petrol was becoming available again, so they gave up the train and sent them to school by bus, which they weren't happy about. It meant they had to get up earlier in the morning, and they got to school on time and they had to leave on time. This did not please them at all. But this was just one of the many instances of road traffic taking over from the railways. It was one of the nails in the coffin. And in 1956, the line was closed down briefly because Miss Rose Bessemer, known as Madge to her friends, who was the granddaughter of Henry Bessemer, who invented the Bessemer converter, amongst other things, which revolutionized the production of steel in the 19th century. I only remember that because when I was at primary school, I had to do a presentation on Henry Bessemer, and I've never forgotten the name. So that is totally irrelevant, but it is random. But Madge Bessemer challenged the closure of the line on the grounds that the original Act of Parliament stipulated that there should be 4 trains a day. And this act had never been repealed. So reluctantly, the line was reopened. And British Railways ran what was called the sulky service. They ran 4 single carriage trains a day with the oldest, most dilapidated carriages they could find. They ran them at completely inconvenient times when they did not connect with East Grinstead or Lewis trains. Nobody used the trains, and this was just the proof that British Railways needed that nobody used the line. So they were able to get over the legal objections, and it was closed for a second time in 1958, only to be opened shortly afterwards as the Bluebell line, heritage line, as it is today. Of course, the line from East Grinstead North wasn't affected, and that survived the 1960s closures as well. It was never in any serious danger, really. But the fact that Dr. Beeching lived in East Grinstead and was a first-class season ticket holder on that Victoria line probably didn't hurt. There is a story which is probably apocryphal, that the townspeople of East Grinstead wanted to call Beeching Way Beeching Cut, but the council wouldn't do it, which is strange in a way because many councils are quite good at unintentional irony when it comes to naming roads, naming them after the things that they knocked down to build them, but no, they wouldn't do it. It would have been appropriate because it is a cut, but it also follows the line of the old Tunbridge Wells, East Grinstead to Tunbridge Wells Railway, which was closed down in 1967. So now we're well away from the village in East Grinstead, but a quick hop back and we'll ask the Bluebell to stop, as they don't normally stop in the village. To get back to the village from the station, there were 2 routes, the Black Path and the Red Path. The Red Path was also known as Rat's Alley, but we're not allowed to call it that anymore. The Black Path came up close to where the playground is now, and that was made up of cinders from the railway. The Red Path came up at Vinyl's Cross, and that was made of bricks. So that's why it's the Red Path. There is a lovely press cutting in the archive of a parish council meeting in 1952 when the maintenance of the Red Path was discussed. They have been having this argument since the formation of the parish council in 1895, I think, even though the county council was supposed to have taken over the maintenance in 1936. But it was an ongoing argument. The argument against maintaining the Red Path, as put forward by a Colonel Scott, name nearly went, with A, that the red path was so steep that only young people could use it, and anybody over 50 would be foolish trying to climb up the red path. And B, that the black path belonged to the railways, that the railways were run by the government, and the government would never shut it down. So the red path was not needed. The meeting decided to take no decision. And as far as I know, the argument still goes on today about who maintains the red path. But if we climb up there, get to the top at Vinel's Cross, back across the road with great care, across Finch Field, Finch Mead as it used to be known when it belonged to Hoathly Hill, and back to the village, and we will pick it up back in the village next time for what will be the penultimate random ramble.